Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
Joining us now, a man that when Dan Snyder's name comes up, this is the man we call, because typically he's the one who's making it come up, and now we get to laugh about it, which is always more joyous than when we were in the thick of it. And in fact, when he treated us with a story this weekend, it was just a great way to start our collective Saturdays that Dan Snyder is apparently miserable watching the Commanders' success. And so before the week transpires and before this story gets too far in the rear view, we're going to bring back our friend Don Natta from ESPN, of course, one of their senior writers, one of the best writers, period, in sports, who, along with his writing partner, Seth Wickersham, chronicled Dan Snyder's misery. Don, thank you, I think is how I welcome you to the show. On behalf of all Commanders fans, thank you for that gift.
Well, you're welcome, Craig, and it's great. It's great to see you. Timing is everything in life and in journalism, and the two wins that the Commanders put together in this magical playoff run was the moment that we felt we absolutely had to drop that story. I know there was some complaining about the timing, but we had to do it because it was germane to Dan Snyder sitting in London on a super yacht, what he was feeling as the Commanders were off on this astonishing playoff run.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm sure there were some people that were like, just who cares about him? But there was no time. You could have dropped that story in the middle of, I'm trying to think of the deadest time in the NFL, the middle of early July next year, right? And people still would have been like, who cares? Let him go be on his yacht. But I actually really appreciated you and Seth doing this, because how does Dan feel about this is a question that has actually come up quite a bit. And sometimes it's more rhetorical of like, could you imagine what Dan must be feeling about this? Why did you and Seth ultimately decide to go find that answer?
Well, last fall, I had a really good source, one of my best sources in NFL circles, say to me, he actually posed a very simple question. He just said, where in the world is Dan Snyder? He said, has anybody in American life, not just in sports, but in American life, disappear the way he has with not a peep? And a lot of the investigative work that Seth and I do together, or the stories that I do, start with a very simple question. And that was the question that was posed to us by a source. And we set out to find out. About October, I came up to DC and did some reporting. So we've been at the story for some time. And again, the timing was simply fortuitous with the Commanders' run to drop it when we did. But we were able to find out a lot, not just about how Dan Snyder perceives the success of the team that he's loved since he was a little boy, but also how difficult it was to get the team away from him in those final hours. And that was part of the reporting. And when Seth and I heard that, we thought, okay, these things can absolutely be put together in a large overview of where Snyder is at right now.
So there's no doubt from a newsworthiness standpoint that that's the most shocking / important part of the story. For those that didn't read it, one, you should at ESPN.com. But two, basically the story goes that Dan would not pass over his bank information to complete the sale until it was basically Joe Gibbs and Tanya getting in his ear being like, you have to go through with this. It sounds very dramatized. It sounds like something out of a movie. How real was that? And what kind of I guess if he hadn't given that, what happens? How close were we to some kind of disaster there?
Well, let me take the first part of your question. It was very dramatic and it was very real. And people around him were absolutely convinced that he was not going to turn over his banking information. This is in the middle of the night on July 20th, 2023. And Snyder is supposed to turn over that information to the Josh Harris group so the $6 billion can be wired to him and the deal can be closed. Remember, the next day, there is going to be a rally at FedEx Field early that afternoon that's scheduled to basically celebrate Josh Harris purchasing the team from Dan Snyder. In the middle of the night, he decides, I don't want to do this. I want to hold on to it. He was very upset, in particular, Craig, about the $60 million fine that he found out very late about that he had to pay to the National Football League. That
So
took
Don,
him.
just real quick. So this, in terms of timeline, I'm trying to remember my days straight between like the pep rally, like we had a big thing with the radio
Yep.
stations. That happened when the NFL voted on the approval of the sale. So the 20th though would have been that day. So the sale gets approved by the league. They announce the fine simultaneously. So we're talking that night. Like the sale has been approved. We've already had our party. It's that midnight crossing into the next day that we're talking about.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, it's that night, and we're talking about 1 a.m, 2 a.m. It is very cinematic. It's people around Snyder, particularly his wife Tanya, urging him, adamantly saying, "You have to do this. I know this was a dream of yours. I know how hard this is to do, but you absolutely have to do it." Joe Gibbs plays an oversized role in this. I don't have any reporting that Joe Gibbs spoke to Snyder that night. I know, though, very close to when that occurred, he was in touch with him more than once and also strongly urged him to relinquish the team. And as I understand it, Joe Gibbs is a hero of Dan Snyder. So Joe Gibbs was instrumental in this. Tad Brown, the CEO of the Josh Harris Group, told a confidant, we quote Brown in our story, saying, "This deal doesn't get done if it's not for Joe Gibbs stepping up." And remember that, Snyder hired Gibbs in 2004. 3 years, he was the head coach of the team for Dan Snyder. So Joe Gibbs's voice was instrumental in this. But yes, it was extremely dramatic. Our sources who had firsthand knowledge of this said they were not sure it was going to happen. And it was really Tanya and others putting pressure on Snyder in the middle of the night to finally do the last act that he would do as owner of the Washington Commanders, and that's to turn over those digits so the deal could be finalized with a $6 billion payment.
Don Van Natta, ESPN senior reporter, with us here on the Hoffman Show. So, do we have any idea what would have happened if he didn't? Like, the sale's been approved. Like, would the NFL have just been like, "Fine, you don't get your $6 billion. We're stripping you of the team"? Like, what? How would that have worked?
It's an interesting question, and I've been asked that by a few folks since the story was published. I'm really not sure. It's complete uncharted territory, right? About what would happen if an owner who agrees to sell his team at agreed upon price, there is a sales agreement in place. Presumably there would have been a lawsuit by the Josh Harris Group to make the deal happen. What the NFL would do at that point, we can only imagine. Dan Snyder had no more friends left among the owners. And we can talk about that because Jerry Jones, and I think, Craig, you and I have talked about this at previous times
Right.
we've chatted about this. Jerry Jones was for years the mentor of Snyder. Snyder was his protege, and he was the last firewall of support, Jerry Jones was, for Snyder. And when that fell in October of 2022, not long after we had done that story that Snyder was telling people he had dug up dirt on Roger Goodell and on Jones and on other people, other owners in the NFL, once that firewall of support fell, Snyder was done. So I can imagine that the owners would have gotten together, and all you need is 24 out of 32 votes to strip somebody of their team. And if Snyder, had held on to his team, beyond that night, if he did not finally cave in to the arguments being made to him by Tanya and others, then I can certainly imagine a scenario where the NFL would have voted to strip the team away from him.
That would have been the ultimate Dan Snyder ending. You played yourself, ultimate ending. Hey man, you bought the team for $300 million. You had no business buying it in the first place. Now you're going to get $6 billion to sell it, which is important because you're $1 billion in debt. And then you fumble that bag. That would have been
let me just say very quickly, Craig. He bought it for $800 million
or 800,
in 1999, and the $6 billion. Obviously, it's this exponential growth in profit over the 23 years that he held, or 24 years that he held the team. That's some amazing money. But he did owe about $1 billion in debt to Bank of America. That's a big reason why he had to sell the team. He had cash flow problems, and the team was last in revenues in the National Football League and local revenues, all sorts of reasons. There were pressure points from all sorts of areas. And the very realistic one of just the financial dire straits, it's hard to believe, but Snyder was in that. I mean, he didn't walk away with $6 billion. He walked away with $5 billion. He owed $1 billion to Bank of America that came off the top. Just like when you sell your house and there's a mortgage, that mortgage payment goes to the bank before you get whatever's left over when you sell your home. Same thing that happens with an NFL franchise.
So the Bank of America part of this is one of the like. There's a couple of loose ends that still need to be tied up. Again, things that we can now look at as DC sports fans, as Commanders fans, with much less stress because they're not going to affect the football team. The team is out of all of this. It's all Dan Snyder's problems. But the NFL is not necessarily in that same case because the guy in Florida who is a former, is it Rothman, I believe,
Yes.
is the former minority partner who sued the NFL, sued Snyder, sued Bank of America for this credit line that you reported on a couple years ago or last year. It's all merged together. But like, how is that any closer to resolution, and what do we keep an eye on for that loose end that still needs to be tied?
Well, that's the one piece of legal business that's still, I think, the most pressing over Snyder's head, the NFL, and obviously Bank of America. Robert Rothman was one of the three limited partners that Snyder had that had no idea Snyder had taken out a $55 million credit line. He was supposed to get their permission. He didn't get it. And so Robert Rothman, at the end of 2023, sued Bank of America. He's not suing Snyder. He's suing Bank of America, but he wants to subpoena Dan Snyder and his lawyers, as well as Roger Goodell and some executives in the National Football League, basically to try to get to the bottom of what did the National Football League, in cahoots with Bank of America, actually do some things that were wrong here. The financial questions that are raised by a $55 million credit line that suddenly go only to Dan Snyder and his partners know nothing about. How did that happen? And as we reported, there was an arbitration that the partners wanted the NFL to do. That arbitration got shut down by Roger Goodell and by Jeff Pash, the general counsel. So there's some serious questions about Snyder's running of the team, how he handled the finances. Remember, there's all sorts of evidence that he was not paying his partners as much money as he should have done. And you learn a lesson as you get to know these owners. If you cost them money and you're one of their partners, that's a cardinal sin. That's not going to sit well with any of your 31 partners. And Snyder also did that. So yes, the litigation between Rothman and Bank of America is very live. As I understand it, subpoenas are going to start going out, including one in London for Snyder. And we'll keep our eye on that in the coming months.
Don Van Natta, ESPN, with us here on the Hoffman Show. So let's get to that's the important stuff. Let's get to the fun, gossipy stuff. How did the relationships deteriorate between Snyder, Jerry Jones, and anybody else that liked him? I know though that list was fairly small by the end.
It was small by the end. Snyder, from the very beginning of coming into the league, rubbed people the wrong way. Remember, he was 34 years old when he bought the team in 1999. He was the youngest person in National Football League history to buy a franchise. He eclipsed Art Modell by just 1 year. Modell was 35 when he bought the Browns way back in 1961. So Snyder was the youngest person to buy a franchise. He was brash. He was actually called by Paul Tagliabue when he was introduced, the perfect person to own an NFL franchise. Those are words that Tagliabue would like to have back now, because in our story, we quote him telling confidants that Dan Snyder is the worst owner in the history of the National Football League. So that's been a journey for Tagliabue from going from that first statement to now how he feels about Snyder. But when Snyder came in, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He very quickly established himself on the broadcast committee. In meetings, he was very brash. We have owners telling me and my colleague Seth Wickersham very early on, the first few years, he just rubbed people the wrong way. He thought he could dictate terms to various people about things. He said, I know more about broadcast, or as much about broadcasting as anybody. That rubbed people the wrong way. But Jerry Jones from the beginning saw in Snyder something of himself. Remember when Jerry Jones came in, he was 46 when he bought the Cowboys back in 1989. He was also young and a bit brash. And so Jerry liked that. And Jerry very quickly created a relationship with Snyder as sort of mentor to protege, which carried all the way through 2023. When the Washington Post first broke the stories about the toxic workplace culture, when there were all sorts of questions about the way Snyder was running the team, among the owners, there were not many friends left by then. And certainly some of the owners who I've talked to on background couldn't stand Snyder, didn't want to be around him. And Jerry was really, as I said, the last firewall of support. through the Beth Wilkinson investigation. And it wasn't, as I understand it, until our story was published in October of 2022, when we reported that Snyder had basically gathered dirt on his fellow partners, including Jerry, and would use that dirt against them if they tried to take his team away. That Jerry said, "Okay, I'm done too." And just 3 weeks after we did that story, Craig, Dan and Tanya Snyder announced they were selling the team.
So that leaves a very sad Dan Snyder somewhere in London or on a yacht somewhere around Europe. Like, what's he doing now? To the extent that we care, but like, what's he doing now?
Well, we reported in the story that he created a investment company that has really just been dormant since he started it. He established it just a few weeks after he announced that he was selling the team back in November of 2022. There's £1 million sitting in the account based on the documents we saw. He hasn't really done much. Now, he did invest $6 million in the Apprentice film about Donald Trump. And then he was screened.
Which he apparently didn't realize that his son-in-law was making a negative film, not a positive film.
That's right. He somehow
Incredible.
He somehow didn't realize until he was sitting somewhere in the Caribbean with his son-in-law, who was in charge of this production company and made the deal for this film, which, as I understand, is a very good movie. I haven't seen it yet, but apparently it's quite good. And there's 2 Academy Award nominations for the 2 main actors in it. And when Snyder screened it, he was stunned, we were told, to discover that it's not a Valentine for Donald Trump, but a very unflattering portrait of Donald Trump. And he pulled the $6 million back. That played out last spring and last summer. That's the one investment that we know about that Snyder has made. And that, of course, turned to a complete mess. And he's in London and he's imagining a second act for himself. One of the things we heard is that there's been some talk that he is interested in investing in a UK-based soccer team, presumably or preferably, as I understand it, in the Premier League. But we also had some other people say they were not sure that was going to happen. But it certainly has been something that's been discussed that we heard about from our sources as maybe an act of redemption. Go get into another league, another team, and see if you can kind of, rewrite the script, flip the script on yourself. That's something that we also heard about that he's contemplating.
So the final parting gift in the eyes of many fans from Dan Snyder was the name Commanders. It is a hot button issue still in DC. It's something that I've said, even though they're not going to go back to the old nickname, or they kind of have to, I think, give fans a real sense of where they are, and it should be one of the top priorities for this new marketing or team president that's coming in on the business side from Campbell's. What do you know about the state of that?
Well, what I heard when Josh Harris and the investors first bought the team, I thought pretty good information that a rebrand was certainly something they were going to consider, because it's something they knew was going to be very popular with the fan base. It's the last sort of stink of Dan Snyder that is still on the team. It's a clean break you can make, because all of the fans know that the Commanders is something that Dan Snyder approved of. What I've heard more recently is that's still on the table, though it is not a top priority. Obviously, a new stadium for Josh Harris and his partners is the top priority. And I believe Josh Harris has said this, but I've heard this from other people around the team, that once they get that done, this is something that they will consider. It's a long process, Craig, as I think fans don't really appreciate. There's a lot of trademark work you have to do, and it's not something that can happen overnight. But they're certainly aware that there is a deep hunger in the fan base for a rebrand, and I would personally be surprised if there is not one.
Interesting. They're definitely the numbers are starting to shift, though, with the success that they've had. Like, Commanders has never been more popular because they've mostly been terrible since they've had that nickname. And all of a sudden, this Daniels kid, Don, he seems pretty good.
Yeah, that's the one thing. Exactly. So because the Commanders had such a great run this past season, and presumably there'll be another one next season, now the name may be looked at in a different light. So that's obviously a very big fat asterisk, right, on any rebrand. As the team has success, Commanders and success will probably become synonymous with many people.
Last thing for Don Van Natta, of course, senior writer for ESPN. There's so much stuff that we have talked about over the last couple of years, Don. Does the NFL, both like as a league office, Roger, that group, but also the ownership, the collective 32 or 31, no Packers owner, obviously, or even 30 if you want to take Josh Harris out of it. Have they learned any lessons from this entire Snyder ordeal?
It's an excellent question. I think they probably have. One lesson is if there is a problem in a franchise, don't reflexively circle the wagons and try to protect that owner. That's obviously the sort of instinct that they have, because any bad headline for an owner is a bad headline for the National Football League, and they have a way that they want to try to minimize that. They did that here, but they minimized it and kept Snyder in place for so long. And it was this bad drumbeat of headline after headline, scandal after scandal. And I think that they do recognize that that was quite damaging, not just to the National Football League as a whole and the brand, but certainly to this franchise. The Washington Commanders is one of the top 5 premier franchises. And for it to be turned into what it was and to be dead last in local revenue and everything else is something that I know from speaking to owners and executives, they want to make sure that doesn't happen again. But by the same token, I do believe that Roger Goodell in part views what happened here as a positive, because remember, Snyder kept getting more and more rope given to him with more and more debt. And the NFL did allow that $55 million credit line. But throughout time, Snyder kept drawing down more debt. And the more debt he drew down, that ended up being really the final kind of cudgel that the owners had for him to go, because he couldn't pay back $1 billion. And so I think part of them also learned a lesson. Well, when you do have an owner that doesn't want to go, one possible way to get rid of them is to just drown them in debt. And that's what happened here.
Yeah, I hear that. I hope that's not the lesson they take away, because they also could have just gotten rid of the problem and not lost a decade of seasons that we're never going to get back in DC, and a generation of fans that many of which will never get back in DC. And so just to be like, oh, he's gone in the end, I think is a fundamental misunderstanding of the damage done in the meantime.
Yeah, that's a great point, Craig. But here's the thing. The NFL did not want to set the precedent of taking a vote to get rid of an owner. They had multiple opportunities to do that. Certainly after Jim Irsay in October of 2023 came out at that owners meeting and said, we have to take another look at Dan Snyder. It was a week after we had dropped that story about the dirt gathering and all that information. Even then, there was no appetite to do it. Now, still within a few weeks, Snyder announced that he was going to sell the team because he knew he had no support left, including Jerry Jones. But I think that that was something that they just do not want to do. They want to use other pressure points when there is an owner like Snyder in the future. And I think one of them is debt, to find other pathways to get rid of them and not set the precedent that they're literally kicking one of their own out of the league.
Don Van Natta, ESPN. Read the story at ESPN.com. There's so much more in there that we didn't get to. And Don, it's always great to chat. I'm sure there'll be more to talk about here in the next couple of weeks and months, just league-wide. And always look forward to when a Don Van Natta byline hits my desk. So, DVN, I always appreciate you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Great to see you. All the best to Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.